So continuing on our presentation now on restoration sexuality, part 3 of our series. This is part 3.2 of transcending this false binary. And in this section, we're going to cover how restoration sexuality views sexual behavior, common themes and language, non-heterosexual relationships, traditional relationships, church doctrine, heterosexual marriage, being single, and handling temptation. And as we look at the way restoration sexuality views these things, we're going to contrast them with the false worldly binary of pride and shame. Okay, how does it see sexual behavior? The pride embrace model says all forms of sexual expression are healthy, are equally good and healthy. We kind of talked about that earlier. God just wants me to be happy. Sexual pleasure is a wonderful thing, probably the most important thing, right? If you're not having sex, you're deprived and you're not able to be fully human. And therefore, sexual pleasure can and should be increased through various tools and techniques. And it's, like I say, vital and to be healthy and happy. And if Pride Embrace Model had a constitution, this would be like the first or second article in it, that it's a right. Everybody has a right to sexual fulfillment, not just sexual behavior, but fulfillment, however we're going to define that. And this is totally unfair for God to ask somebody to consecrate their sexuality to him, right? It's okay to ask somebody to sacrifice to go on a mission, to sacrifice to pay their tithing, to sacrifice in accepting a certain calling. But God is never, it's a no-go zone for God to ask somebody to consecrate their sexuality. It's the no-go zone. In contrast, the sin, shame, disease model says non-heterosexual sin is abomination, uniquely abominable, more grave and shameful than any other. This is something we hide and we never speak about it. If we've done it, we're going to take this secret to my grave. And I'll just point out that's also convenient because that also allows you to keep doing it. But it also gives you this kind of prideful martyr complex, ironically, where I am going to bear the burden of my sins. And yes, I will suffer. I'll even take a lesser kingdom because it would hurt somebody else to do that. There's a unique view that this is disease-ridden, specifically homosexual behavior is disease-ridden. There's this millstone I deserve to be hanging around my neck. It's this thorn in my flesh that's going to torment me. Now, Dan, what do we say about thorns?
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up. In one of my presentations, I talk about the thorn in the flesh, and I interpret it in a little bit different way, maybe than people sometimes do. In my area where I live, we have stuff grows everywhere. We have green plants everywhere, and including plants with thorns. And you just have to work with those plants a little bit differently than other plants. The fact that you have plants with thorns on your property doesn't mean you're a terrible gardener or whatever. They just exist, right? So if, I like to think about what Paul said about having a thorn in the flesh. You don't have to attach shame or fear to thorns. They're just a reality that we live with, and you just have to work with them and come to understand them. And that's about it.
And in the sin, shame, disease model, we see it as a curse, that thorn in the flesh. Because if we shift to the restoration model, you see there at the bottom, it says, my grace is sufficient. God's grace is sufficient for us. Whatever our challenges are, it's not because we're cursed or God hates us. But going back to the top there, a procreative sex is, according to the restoration model, the highest and best form within a covenantal marriage. It's the highest and best form of sexual expression. That doesn't mean it only has to be for the purpose of producing children, but I just mean in a marriage that's open to life. Sexuality is a gift from God, but as we said before, it's a stewardship. It's not for me alone to use, but united with the opposite sex and consecrated to a higher purpose in God's glory, then it is beautiful and fulfilling within the bounds the Lord has set. And there's wonderful abundance there. And so, yeah, if there's tools and techniques you have within this kind of marriage to make that more fulfilling, that's great. There's no problem with that. There are also ways to express our sexuality righteously and chastely, even if we're single. And we're going to cover that in our ministry slide. So I've got a link to that slide there, where we talk about that in more detail, believe it or not. And remember, again, this stewardship that we consecrate to God and his purposes. And let's look at just the ways people language about sexuality from these two contrasting things. They may not use these exact words, but these are the kind of themes you'll see from people in these different models. The Pride Embrace model talks a lot about inclusion, unconditional acceptance, celebration, pride, frequent, maybe even constant emphasis on this aspect of the person. Whereas the sin, shame, disease model talks about struggle, conflict. Again, that surgery model, we're going to cut it out. We're going to destroy it. We're going to burn it. We're going to kill it. We're going to ignore it, hope it goes away. The restoration model says, and it has the kind of notions of transcendence, of belonging. And let me just contrast belonging to inclusion. Inclusion is something you have to do to me or I have to do to you. I have to include you. Belonging is a two-way street. And it's also something that's created together communally, is that spirit of belonging. If I don't belong, that might be because of other people. It might be because of me. So I like this idea of belonging better than inclusion. You'll hear talk about connection, a connection with other people that might share your sexual minority status, and also with others, and being able to connect with other people in other circumstances that you can also learn from and benefit from them, even if they maybe don't completely understand or aren't completely the same as you. You can still connect with them and bless and be blessed by them. This idea of submitting to a higher power, a higher will, higher purpose, consecrating our desires, bridling or channeling. These are all sort of themes we see in the restoration model. How do people see non-heterosexual relationships? I'm going to start on the sin, shame, disease side first of all. So they'll see gay couples, for example, as always inherently unhealthy. They're always promiscuous. If you're in the sin, shame, disease model, you think, oh, I could never be happy that way. It would just never work.
And you're speaking as a sexual minority.
Yes.
Right?
Looking
at
yes.
other sexual minorities in their relationships.
Yes, in their same-sex relationships. Yes. I could never do that. I can't do that. And I would never be happy that way. And they may look happy, but they're not really happy. They're just really good at pretending, but they're not happy. The divorce is inevitable. It's just a matter of time until they get divorced. And for myself, again, as a sexual minority, I have to get married heterosexuality, even if it means lying and hiding. So my spouse might run if I tell him or her about myself. So I'm going to just hide this, pretend, whatever it takes to get somebody to marry me, because I'm so broken and flawed being single, and it's so impossible for me to have a same-sex relationship. I'm just going to hide, repress, deny, lie, whatever it takes to do to have that happen. Now, the Pride Embrace model says gay couples are exactly the same as straight couples in value and satisfaction, in emotional health and stability, in righteousness, because all family types are approved by God. And as a friend of mine says, if you think that this is a contest between who has the strongest attachment bond, then yes, there are gay couples that have that, right? And so in the sense of passion and devotion, in those sense, yes, gay couples can do that. So there's, again, some truth there. But the restoration model says that same-sex relationships are a cul-de-sac, right? This is not a street that will lead you anywhere. That's the end. Because of what the gospel teaches us about the destiny of the celestial kingdom and male-female sealing and priests, priestesses, kings and queens united in a creative, glorious union for the eternities. If you believe that, then the restoration model says, yeah, same-sex couples can be happy and healthy by the world standards, and they can even be really good people. They often are. I have learned so much from some gay couples about hospitality, about sacrificial love, about devotion. But there's a limit to how far they can go. They can only go so far in that down that cul-de-sac.
So,
whereas eternal lives are promised to those with an opposite sex union. Go ahead, Dan.
yeah, and this definitely, and I don't know if you're going to cover this at some point, but this applies to so many other areas of our spirituality. I have a lot of friends who are not members of the church and who do not live gospel principles.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not all miserable people.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, like, wow, they seem to be doing pretty well. And I don't have to I don't have to look at them and say, oh, and invent some kind of narrative of their misery, right?
Yeah, but we'll do that, right? You've in your work in faith transitions, you'll sometimes hear people say, oh, if you leave the church, you can never be happy. And that's convenient. If we're a little insecure in our own testimonies, we kind of need to say that.
Yeah.
But you say that's not always true.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And my devotion to the gospel and my love of Christ and my yearnings for more of what Christ offers me, those things don't depend on other people being miserable with their bad choices. They don't depend at all on that. Like, they can be gloriously happy. It doesn't it's not going to change my commitments, right?
Yeah. And I'll just share a personal witness here. This was such a breakthrough for me. The Spirit kind of told me, Jeff, you could be happy in a same-sex relationship. And I'm like, what? Because I was very much on that shame disease model where I could never be happy that way. And none of them are really happy. And so that kind of rocked my world. But then I went on to learn I'd also been shown what I could have. And the Lord showed me it was not what He had designed for me or planned for me. As satisfied and content as I would be, God had something higher and greater and more glorious for me. And the vision that I caught of that was worth the sacrifices I made. Not that I was perfect. I stumbled around a lot, and I was ungrateful, and I was proud, and I was stuck in shame. I had all that too, but haltingly, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I was still persuaded of that. And I was also warned by the Lord. I need to add this, that there are spiritual gifts you have, Jeff, that you will lose if you choose to go down that cul-de-sac. And we can see that sometimes with people in their faith transitions, where some things about them stay the same, and some things don't. And let's just be universal about this too. It's not just the sexual minorities that can just carry over into the next world. Depending on how we define heterosexuality, there's a lot of aspects of heterosexuality that are highly problematic that I don't believe are compatible with what God has planned for His highest glory. And so in that sense, the genocide, the celestial genocide, and the erasure is very inclusive. It's not just picking on the gays. There's a lot of things that will not survive. In fact, nothing, as C.S. Lewis puts it, nothing that does not submit to death, that is not willing to be transformed and surrendered to God, can rise. Nothing that we refuse can rise with us. And, divorce is tragic. Even among same-sex couples, it is still a sad thing. I have a few friends who were in same-sex relationships and either jointly or individually came to the conclusion that that should not continue. And that was still a tragic heartache. And it entailed some sacrifices. And even though the Lord led them out and away from that, it was still a sad thing. So it's never anything we want to celebrate. Now, what's interesting is if we flip this around and say, well, what about traditional relationships for sexual minorities? What about a gay person in what's called a mixed orientation marriage? What's interesting is this flips. And the people in the Pride Embrace model now say, what the sin, shame, disease model said about same-sex relationships, they say about opposite-sex relationships. They feel like mixed orientation marriages, which I hate that term. I just consider myself heterosexually married, but it is the term. It seems like I'm in a zoo or I'm some weird, freakish object to study. But they see those kinds of relationships as always inherently unhealthy and promiscuous. All right, it's just a matter of time until I cheat on my wife. And that I, as a sexual minority, if I'm in the pride embrace model, I could never be happy in a relationship that way. They're not really happy, and gay divorce is inevitable. There's a couple of tweaks here, right? It'd be mixed orientation divorce is inevitable. And a person puts the expectation on, right? If I'm in the pride embrace model and I see a heterosexual couple that can't keep their hands off each other, just can't wait to have all kinds of sex all the time, and they're always enjoying it. It's always incredible and amazing. That kind of caricature, I call it a caricature because I don't think it's that common. And I work with heterosexual couples in marriage. And I would say even there, this is the exception. Maybe for a certain time period, this is common, maybe newlyweds or whatever. But various sexual incompatibilities, differences in desire, all kinds of things make this a caricature. But sometimes sexual minorities will have this caricature and say, if I don't have that same intensity of sexual desire and romance for my opposite sex partner that I've seen, maybe felt when I've done same-sex dating or what I've fantasized about in porn or whatever, then I'm being inauthentic. I'm depriving myself, and it's somehow inauthentic to both myself and my spouse. And they will also tell you that the church discourages them. Now, the sin, shame, disease model on traditional relationships will say that that's going to be proof I'm cured, right? If I could just have that, if I could just get heterosexually married, then I'm cured. Then I'm fixed. Then I've arrived. I don't have to worry about anything else. Again, is that the Lord's way? Does the Lord think married people have arrived? I would strongly contest that. But once I'm married, I can be fully accepted and happy as a member of the church. And I need to be the typical husband or wife that that heterosexual caricature is, those same sort of roles, those same sort of ways, the same way a husband is supposed to be always sexually voracious, or the wife is always supposed to be submissive and super feminine or whatever. I have to fit that mold, even if it means pretending. And because this is so important, I probably shouldn't tell my spouse beforehand. And if I don't match up to, again, this caricature of the way I think normal marriages should be, then I'm failing myself. So I just need to pretend harder. And the church pushes these marriages on sexual minorities, is the story. So what does the restoration model say? That, yeah, it's an ideal to revere and strive for, though strive we take under advisement, because strive can look different ways, right? Maybe you're not in a position to date heterosexually right now. So maybe all it means is being open to that at some point in the future. But so that's where I say, whatever way works for you at the moment right now. The Lord isn't asking us to make the whole journey. He's just asking us to step one way. And that next step may or may not be marriage or even dating right now. It is a viable option for some people. For sexual minorities, the courtship and marriage doesn't usually follow the typical pattern. And that's okay. In fact, sometimes I say we often do it backwards, whereas traditionally there's a sexual attraction that then drives into some deeper intimacy. For us, we sexual minorities, it often starts with an emotional intimacy or connection that then develops into a physical attraction, which, believe it or not, does happen, can happen, is possible. And that's kind of backwards, but I don't think that makes it worse. What I've seen in my work with a lot of couples is that spark, that passion, that sexual passion sometimes fades or leaves entirely. And now all of a sudden the couple has to decide, are they going to continue? And if you're in a pride embrace model, even as a heterosexual, you're going to say, no, I need to find somebody else that does it for me. If you're in the restoration model, you'd say, well, maybe there's still a way to work our way through this. And there is. We've got a lot of therapeutic models for that. Crucible therapy, sensate focus. There's a lot of things you can do there. Just what the restoration model says to the pride embrace people, just like it said to the shame disease people last time. Divorce is always going to be tragic. It's not something you should cheer on or expect or celebrate. I can't. If I had a nickel for everybody who told me my marriage was doomed, that I'm just faking it, I'd be pretty well off. These marriages probably are more challenging than other marriages. And some of that is because of the way the world sees them as inauthentic, as somehow faking it. And there are some other challenges too. It's not just the world, back to that locus of control. But when they are good, they're really, really good marriages. There's some really wonderful marriages here. And so I wouldn't play the odds. Whether you're going to seek a same-sex relationship or an opposite-sex relationships, I would not tell you to just play the odds. So
when you say it's not a game of odds, what do you mean by that?
I mean, you shouldn't say, if you're trying to decide, let's say you're a sexual minority, you say, should I date the same sex or the opposite sex? Well, the world is going to say, oh, you don't have a chance to date the opposite sex. That's not. And
how do they calculate whether you have a chance or not?
Well, that's the thing, is what I have so many people say is, oh yeah, that's just so rare. That's just so unlikely. And so they're playing what they think the odds are, but they're not actually the odds. And the odds don't even matter because, you know, until Sir Edmund Hillary, what were your odds of successfully climbing Mount Everest? 0. Now they're better, but there's still a lot of people who die that way. The question to ask yourself is, do you want to climb Everest or Kilimanjaro? Right? What is worth it to you? If we just play it safe all the time, we're not going to be very satisfied. Your chances, so nobody else's success, don't let anybody else's success or failure dictate your own. I remember a friend of mine who has same-sex attraction. He got married to a woman, and a family member said to me, well, Jeff, what are you doing? What is he doing that you're not doing? Just because he did it, right, doesn't mean that I could do it.
Right.
And even if I did the same things he did, doesn't mean anything. So don't let anybody else's success or failure color your own experience.
So when I got married to my wife, as a 100% straight dude, at the time that happened, I had pretty much said, there's no chance I'm going to be getting married. You know, I had kind of given up. Even
though you're straight, you had given up on marriage?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everybody around me, most of my friends and family, it was pretty straightforward. They just found who they were compatible with, got married. And for me, it was like this impossible thing, you know, because I have a quirky personality and who knows what else. There are things wrong with me, right, Jeff? What's wrong with you? So I was, you know, but at that
You're
time,
single, what's wrong with you? Yes.
So at that time, I had really calculated, like, I just don't see this happening anymore. You know, I'm in my 30s, and how many times have I tried and failed? And other people have tried and succeeded. So the odds must be against me. Right.
Yeah. So that's how we can play the odds too, and that's our second arrow again.
Yep.
And we won't go into depth here, but the Victorian ideal of companionate romantic marriage has, in this ideal of fulfillment, is wonderful in a lot of ways. It's also fairly recent, but it is a two-edged sword because, and I'm going to link to Ty's talk, Ty Mansfield, our friend Ty Mansfield talks about companionate marriage. He says, signing our name on a piece of paper and kneeling across an altar for 15 minutes does not magically endow it with the constantly renewed, ever expanding creative vitality necessary to make an eternal union truly sustainable to the eternities. And Ty, when he says this, is not talking about mixed orientation marriage. He's talking about marriage, period. And that burden of companionate marriage says that, yeah, when people are married, they're often more satisfied. But because of the pressure that's puts on people, it also causes more divorce. It's interesting. You can drill into that more in that link. Okay. Let's look at the church doctrine on sexuality and marriage. How does the Pride Embrace model look at it? And they say it's going to change to allow same-sex sealings, and perhaps even more, though we leave that vague, right? What about those poor polyamorous people? That's their sexual orientation. And they think that advocacy from within and pressure from without will hasten the arrival of that day. And the reason why we don't embrace same-sex sealings, for example, is because the church leaders just don't know enough sexual minorities. They're ignorant, they're inexperienced, there may be prejudice, there's bias, there's homophobia, heteronormativity. And once they know enough LGBT people, then they'll change, especially when they see how miserable they are. Then they'll change the doctrine. And it's just like blacks in the priesthood, in that we were limiting the temple to a subset of people and we expanded it. So we just need to expand it a little more. Just like we expanded to black people, we need to expand that to gay people. And it's also just like plural marriage. The government forced the church to abandon this practice. So likewise, the government is going to force the church to allow same-sex sealings and same-sex sexual behavior. And fortunately, though, in the progressive vision, governments are only going to force my church to do what I think they should do anyway. They're never going to force the church to do something I don't like. The government here is only an instrument of progressive goals and positive, good things, never anything negative. Now, the sin, shame, disease model says the proclamation on the family is just something to feel guilty about. It's something to like wince and cringe every time I hear. And, you know, I'm constantly falling short and I'll never be acceptable to God or the church. And the proclamation just shows how I'm always falling short. It's not an ideal to strive towards. It's just showing me how I'm failing. And it's just more proof that I'm hopeless and unacceptable and that I'm lost and broken. The restoration model says gender and gender complementarity are eternal principles. And the highest and holiest relationship is a royal priestly marriage. It's not this intense romance, that's sexual desire all constantly. And the church's doctrine on sexuality and marriage enables an infinite and glorious creation. It does place demands on all who have entered this divine order and even those who seek to enter the divine order. It is demanding, but it's also an incredible glory. And do we think that could be cheap? Nothing that is great and wonderful would not require sacrifice. Thomas Paine once said, "Heaven knows how to put a proper price on its goods." So it is going to be demanding. The celestial kingdom will also not contain certain worldly ideas around heterosexuality. This and sexuality and marriage, even though this has you will see rhetoric about this in the church, this Victorian ideal of romantic love and love objects, which isn't necessarily bad, but it is not God's model of priestly union. Again, read Ty's Fair Conference Address from 2022. And also I've got a link to Michael Hannon, who has an essay. He's a Christian, he's not Latter-day Saint, but he's got an essay called Against Heterosexuality, where he says even the construct of heterosexuality is limiting and harmful to Christians. So read those and you'll see how we want to transcend some of these identities and constructs that might be limiting us, even as we affirm this gender complementarity. Okay, what is the role and importance of heterosexual marriage? We kind of talked about this before, but here you see the Pride Embrace model says it's unjust, it's unfair, it's unrealistic, it's going to lead to misery, loneliness, and probably suicide. And the sin, shame, disease model, you know, this is a trial to be born. It's my life's on hold until I can be married. Being single makes me unworthy of full participation in the church. The restoration model says being married can be a calling and an opportunity to bless and serve in unique ways for as long as it lasts. Let's contrast this view with being single in the church. The Pride Embrace model again says It's unjust, unfair, unrealistic, and will lead to misery, loneliness, and probably suicide. And the sin, shame, disease model says, again, if I'm single, it's a child to be born. My life's on hold until I'm married. Being single makes me unworthy of full fellowship and participation in the church. In both cases, sin and pride, shame says, I'm doing it wrong. Pride says someone else is doing it wrong.
Yep.
That locus of control again. Restoration model views it the same way, being single, as it does being married. It's a calling and opportunity to bless and serve in unique ways, as long as that might last. Just like we could be widowed or divorced, we can be single for a long period of time. Okay, how should we handle temptation? The pride embrace model says we should revel in that, indulge it, because it's harmful to try to limit this in any way. Lust says we objectify someone. It's very reductive. I think of it as like zooming in on, it's very often about a specific part of the body, specific aspect of the person. There's a lot of money people are making online in pornography by catering. And again, I'm not talking about sexual minorities. I'm just talking about in general, about specific niche fetishes or interests. And so again, that just shows how reductive and objectifying it is, that you can only be aroused by this unique variety of object. And alas, it is an object, even though the tragedy is there are human beings behind all this. When we're in lust, it's not really about their humanity. That's the last thing you want to know about. It's about possession. And I call it idolatry because it's an objectification that is worshipped in a way. And it glorifies the creature or the thing that is created rather than the author of that creation, which is God. And again, I'm quoting a scripture. It changes the truth of God into a lie. When we're tempted, especially tempted to lust, we turn the truth of something into a lie. And another theme we do in the scriptures, we're going to read some scriptures in it, is extortion. And extortion means to take by deception or theft. And again, it's insatiable. It's never enough. I was in a men's group where they were talking about compulsive sexual behavior. And one of them was just talking about how he got on Instagram and was following all these beautiful, scantily clad models. And he just talked about how he scrolled for hours and hours and hours. And that's what happens. We see that in social media in general. But notice here with lust, again, there was never enough. And it will never be enough. You could scroll for 2 weeks straight and you might go blind, but you never have enough, never be satisfied. Now, the sin, shame, disease model says to handle lust, we're just going to avoid it. We're going to close our eyes. We're going to avert our gaze. And sometimes you do need to do that. Like I said, there's not wrongness in all this, but we're afraid of it. We deny it. We suppress it. We just want to make it disappear, not to exist. We can resent beautiful people or tempting things. We see this sometimes, most obviously in Islam, where you blame the woman, right? If she's not wearing the head to toe where you can just see her eyes, it's her fault. It's her fault. She's tempting me, causing me to sin. Whereas the pride embrace model is about possessing them. This is about dispossessing, disembodied. We don't even have any gratitude for our own bodies. We're disconnected and dispossessed from our own selves. And that's how we can easily go into someone else. We deny or resent the divinity in God's creation, both within ourselves or within others. We change the truth of God into a lie in different ways. We'll talk about it in a minute. What is the lie? You can ask yourself when you're tempted to lust, what is the lie I'm wanting to believe? The fascinating thing about porn is how much of a lie it is. It's a very convincing lie, but it's a lie because the people who are creating the pornography are not having the experience the people watching it are. And so sometimes in couples, I'll work with them. And again, this isn't unique to sexual minorities. I will have to help them recalibrate their sexuality because they'll sometimes try to reenact or recreate that intense, lustful experience they have with porn in their marriage. And it never works because real sexuality is with another human being who has their own thoughts and feelings, desires. That's what makes it beautiful and wonderful. But it also is what porn isn't, which is all about possession, and it's all about making that person do what you want. And so sometimes that's something to recalibrate for that. But likewise, responding to lust does not have to be about white knuckling or repressing, though sometimes that's what you need, right? You need that emergency brake. When you have it, you're glad to have that willpower, that white knuckle. But in the long term, there's a more peaceful way we can approach this. And these scriptures, which we'll read in a minute, talk about that. We can appreciate someone's beauty. Again, I'm not talking about looking at porn in this case, but just somebody on the street might, or you see in a store or something might trigger this. And you'll go to a part of their body or something that's triggering. Instead of that, we can appreciate that experience, that beauty of that person, maybe her hair or his muscles or whatever, but we don't need to possess it, and we don't need to hold on to it. We recognize that everything has a season. Beauty, particularly among humans, is a transitional phase. And when we see beautiful people or nature scenes or whatever, it's really the same. We can glorify God and recognize that this is an aspect of his beautiful creation. We can love the truth, even if it's painful. That's a theme in our series over and over again. And the painful thing might be, I will never have the muscles of whoever. And I am now older than some movie stars that are really beautiful. So that's not going to be me. I'm not going to look like movie star Joe Blow. And I'm maybe not going to be married to one either. And that's okay, because I have what I have, and I've been given what I've been given is enough. And then we also recognize that nobody, no matter how beautiful they are, can hold a candle to the glory of our own resurrected body. We know this from scriptures, that when resurrected beings and even angelic beings appear to mortals, they are tempted to worship them because they are so glorious. So when we think about what God has destined for each of us, there is really no room for envying. And envy is also something, as Neil A. Maxwell talked about, something that brings us no pleasure. So why do we want to envy? And lust is really, I think, a cousin to, or maybe a form of envy. And so it really is not an enjoyable experience ultimately, because it focuses on what we don't have. And so that pulls us out of the ingratitude. So here, let's talk about some scriptures that talk about handling temptation. So here's Corinthians. First of all, there's no temptation that has taken you, but such as common to man. And that should help those of us that are maybe prone to the sin, shame, disease to say, look, you're not special. Paul here is saying that whatever your temptation is, other people have felt it, and that's okay. And God won't allow you to be tempted above what you're able. And sometimes we stop right there. We forget the second bit. But will with the temptation also make a way to escape, about you'll be able to bear it. So there was somebody I was working with who frequented a place where sexual activity is known to happen. And he went there knowing it's known to happen. And he said to me, Jeff, I just didn't have enough willpower. I went further than I wanted to go. And I said to him, well, I actually think you had a lot of willpower. You lasted a lot longer than I probably would have in that situation. In fact, I think you think too highly of your willpower. I think if you were more humble about the limits to your willpower, you wouldn't put yourself in that situation in the first place. So we need to have a healthy respect for our lack of willpower and take this escape that God has promised us here. Take that escape, get out of the situation before we're going to break. Here is Romans 1. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. There's the gratitude again, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Look at how much innovation goes towards gratifying sexuality, right? There's whatever new invention is, somebody's going to turn it to a sexual use. Those are what I think he's talking about here. Part of what he's talking about when he says vain imaginations. But thinking themselves or professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of an uncorruptible God into an image. This is the idolatry that we see happening. Made like to corruptible man and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. It's an image. And we forget that these sometimes lust. I have clients who sometimes say, oh, I thought a Greek god walked in the room and I was just overcome with lust. Think about that, how I don't know that they appreciate how telling that is when they say that, right? Literally, there's an object, a statue that they're adoring or worshiping. They've turned this human being into a deity that they then worship as if it were God. And if we allow that to get out of control, God will give us over to uncleanness through the lusts of our hearts, to dishonor our own bodies between themselves, right? So that will lead to other sexual behaviors and changes the truth of God into a lie. So again, the heuristic I want to offer you here when you're tempted to lust or other temptations is say, where is the lie in this sin I'm tempted to commit? Where is that lie? Ask yourself that question. Use that heuristic. In this case, Paul says they worshiped and served the creature, that created being, more than the creator, who is blessed forever. God is the one that created our bodies. God is the one that put us here on earth. That is who we need to give glory to and worship, not any other human being. Here is Doctrine and Covenants 59. This is the abundance that I love. Verily, this is fasting and prayer. In other words, rejoicing in prayer. And inasmuch as you do these things, first of all, it's funny to think about fasting, which is depriving ourselves of an appetite, right? That Heavenly Father equates that in this revelation with rejoicing. What could be joyful about deprivation? If you're in that pride embrace model, nothing. But if you're in the restoration model, you will see glimmers of this. And this applies to any desire, appetite we're choosing not to indulge in. If we choose not to indulge in, right? Not because somebody's making me, not because God said I'm going to hell, but because of the vision we've caught and the joy we've glimpsed, we choose to not indulge in an appetite. It can be a cause of rejoicing, believe it or not. And God promises us abundance. Inasmuch as ye do these things with thanksgiving, with cheerful hearts and countenances, but with a glad heart and cheerful countenance. Again, that's important, right? We can't just fake this and do this grudgingly. In fact, that explains why a lot of people who say, well, I tried really hard, and then they don't have the outcome they want. Well, I believe them. They probably tried really hard, but did they look at their heart and renovating their heart and their desires so they were doing it gladly and cheerfully? That's a tall order to get to, but maybe if there was more focus there, their obedience might have been more sustainable. Right? You can yank on that emergency brake and it's going to wear out and fail eventually. Verily, I say that inasmuch as you do this, the fullness of the earth is yours. The beasts of the fields and the fowls of the air and that which climbeth upon the trees and walketh upon the earth, yea, and the herb and the good things which come of the earth, whether for food or for raiment, clothing, or for houses or for barns or for orchards or for gardens or for vineyards. Just look at this list, this litany, this fullness, this abundance that the Lord is promising. Yea, all things which come of the earth in the season thereof are made for the benefit and use of man, both to please the eye. Yes, these things are made to be beautiful, and to gladden the heart, to make us glad. Yea, for food or for raiment, for taste and for smell, to strengthen the body and to enliven the soul. These things help us feel alive. And it pleaseth God that he hath given all these things unto man. For unto this end were they made to be used. With judgment, that's very important. Not to excess, that's very important. Neither by extortion. So if you are tempted to use someone or something with poor judgment, and it's never enough, and you want to take or steal or deceive, you're not doing it the way the Lord has planned it here. And in nothing doth man offend God, or against none is his wrath kindled, save those who confess not his hand in all things. and obey not his commandments. Again, that lack of gratitude, recognize that God is the author of this. And so we don't have to take or seize. But Dan, you wrote an article about demons and the 3 temptations of Christ.
Yep. Yeah, and the gist of the article was that Satan's influence it can be expressed in those 2 words: you need. And
it's bottomless,
right,
endless.
Right. And what I argued in the article is that I believe that Christ's Sermon on the Mount happened after that temptation experience, and some of it reflects the lessons of his temptation experience. Because so much of the Sermon on the Mount the premise is you have in abundance, consider the lilies of the field, right?
Take no thought for the morrow.
Right. Mm-hmm. You are okay. Do you think your heavenly Father can't give you everything that you need, right? Mm-hmm. And those passages never really stood out to me until I contrasted them with the temptations.
With
right.
What Satan was saying, to gratify your appetites, gratify your need for attention and recognition, or control.
Crave. You need.
Versus this restoration model, as I call it, of abundance.
Yeah.
And I love the example of the Israelites who gathered manna. What happened when the Israelites tried to gather more than they needed for one day? Unless it was before the Sabbath, that manna would rot.
Yeah.
It would turn putrid. And again, when we try to take what isn't ours, and what isn't offered and what cannot be offered, it will putrefy. Whereas if we allow all the beauties of the earth, other human beings, yes, but a sunset, nature, all these things are ours, right? I live in a neighborhood with a lot of beautiful houses, and sometimes I'll go to coveting and I'll say, oh, I wish I had that house or that landscaping. But then I'll say, you know what? I just drove by that beautiful landscaping and it didn't cost me anything. This poor person has to pay for that landscaping. That pleased my eye and gladdened my heart to see that beautiful artistry of God with the creations and the person, the landscape designer who did it. And it's beautiful. And I can appreciate it just as much as the person who owns that house. I don't have to possess it, right? And then I drive by and see something else. And there's different seasons of that yard that I see, and it looks different at different times of the year. But I can appreciate those things and not have to possess them. And if I just drove by feeling miserable because I can't afford that landscaping, I wouldn't enjoy it.